everyone. Welcome to today's virtual lunch bunch. Thank you for joining us. Today, Dr. Judy will be talking about childhood sexual abuse and the impact on adult well-being. The handout was sent out early this morning, but if you did not receive it, please put your email in the chat and I will send it over to you now. If you have any questions, you can also put them in the chat, or at the end, I will stop the recording and then we'll open up the floor for anyone who would like to speak at that time. Dr. Judy, I will turn it over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Sarah. Welcome, everybody. This is an important topic, and I'm really glad you joined us for it. Let me talk about what we're going to do next month, just so you have a heads up. It's one I've done before called Hello from Heaven. What I wrote about it is there life after death? Do our loved ones visit us after they die? Will we be reunited with loved ones in the future? These compelling questions have fascinated people for centuries. People who have died and been revived report consistent experiences, including feeling embraced by unconditional love. They return with a similar and compelling message about the importance of loving yourself and loving others. 50 million Americans, which is 1 out of every 5, have had an experience where they felt the presence of a deceased loved one. 63% of spouses report that they feel that a lost partner has been around them. So want to know if you've had a similar experience and whether you'd like to know more about people who have and what those experiences were like. And come next month and we'll talk about these compelling and complex and important experiences. I have done this talk before. I may try to find some new videos, but it's just full of good lessons. And if we could love ourselves as much as we are apparently loved from the other side, we'd be healthier and happier people. So it's a great message. If you've attended before, you don't want to, that's fine, but certainly pass it on to people because I think for a lot of people it's a very important talk. So let's talk about childhood sexual abuse. First, what constitutes sexual abuse? The National Child Traumatic Study Stress Network defined it as any interaction between a child and an adult or another child, usually an older child, in which the child is used for the sexual stimulation of the perpetrator or somebody who's observing. It can include both touch and non-touching behaviors. Non-touching behaviors include things like voyeurism, trying to look at a child's naked body, exhibitionism, exposing yourself, or exposing the child to pornography. Prevent Child Abuse of North Carolina used a similar definition. They said there are 2 main types of child abuse, touching and non-touching. Touching includes touching a child's genitals, making a child touch someone else's genitals, playing sexual games, or putting objects or body parts inside the vulva, vagina, and the mouth, the anus of a child for sexual pleasure. I know those are not fun things to hear, but I don't want us to be afraid to talk about what this really involves. Non-touching, as we mentioned, includes showing pornography to children. A lot of people, men especially, who groom children will start by showing them, dirty pictures. So it's things like showing children pornography, exposing themselves, prostituting or trafficking children, photographing a child in sexual poses, encouraging a child to watch or hear sexual acts, either in person or on a video, or watching a child undress or use the bathroom. So, it doesn't always involve the most obvious, but it is equally devastating. And a lot of those other behaviors are part of how the perpetrator grooms somebody to do increasingly more sexual things with them. How common is it? I'm always shocked by how common it is. Townsend and Reingold back in 2013 said their studies suggest that 1 in 7 girls and 1 in 25 boys will be sexually abused. However, the National Center for Victims of Crime suggests the rates are more like 1 in 5 girls and 1 in 20 boys. And more recent data from the Advocacy Center says 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 5 boys are victims of childhood sexual abuse. So those are pretty startlingly high numbers. It's more common than people recognize. It's difficult to get a very accurate rate of the prevalence of child sexual abuse because 85% of child victims never report their abuse. It's very rare for a child to report their abuse. We're going to talk about why children don't tell. We're going to talk about why, even as an adult, sometimes it's hard to remember whether you were sexually abused or exactly what happened.
How is your mother?
We're going to talk about, common problems. Somebody's got to mute themselves, I think.
She's off
She
balance.
she had her walker, but she's wobbly.
All right.
Somebody
Has somebody in the room talking? Can you
Probably
mute
didn't
yourself?
go into it.
All right.
We
I'll
had
keep.
a
Trying
cup
to
of coffee when we
find who it
got
is,
back to the
Dr.
house.
Judy.
Yeah, you're trying to figure out who it is. Kathleen, do you have somebody in the room talking? Okay. I'm trying to single anybody out. I just want to make sure we're, I think I just did something wrong. Did I knock myself off at Zoom? Oh my goodness.
You're on there.
Oh, okay, I'm back on. All right, let me get back to the talk. Sorry for the distraction. Other studies have confirmed the fact that victims generally don't disclose their abuse. Two-thirds of adults who recognized in retrospect that they had been abused as children reported they did not disclose the abuse during childhood, and we'll talk about why, and also how that shapes the child's experience and how it carries into adulthood. The organization called Darkness to Light cited research that supports the likelihood that most sexual abuse goes unreported. They wrote, researchers estimate that 38% of child victims disclose the fact that they've been sexually abused. So it's less than 40%. So that means at least 62% don't report it, and the other statistics say it's even higher. And of those who told, 40% will tell a close friend rather than an adult or an authority figure. These friend-to-friend disclosures do not always result in reports. In fact, they often don't result in reports. This means the vast majority of child sexual abuse incidents are never reported to authorities. So any crime statistics grossly underestimate how much sexual abuse goes on. And it has a lot to do with how the perpetrator treats them and the feelings of shame they internalize, but we'll get into that. The National Association of Adult Survivors of Child Abuse says there are more than 42 million survivors currently in the United States. So if you've had this experience, you are certainly not alone. 42 million other people in this country have experienced this. According to the Internet Crime Against Children Task Force, 1 in 5 kids are solicited sexually online. So that's a whole new way for perpetrators to get access to children. 1 in 5, I think that's pretty startling. You know, think of 5 kids, one of those has probably been approached online by a perpetrator. Most people think that adult rape is a crime of greater magnitude and even importance, but the fact is children are victimized at a much higher rate than adults when it comes to sexual assault. Nearly 70% of all sexual assaults, and that includes adults, happen to children 17 and under. 70% of rapes happen to children. And about 90% of children who are abused know their abuser. This is in part why sexual abuse is so traumatizing. It is done by usually someone who is known to the family. What do we know about perpetrators of sexual abuse? Well, I'm quoting from Darkness to Light. Those who molest children look and act like everybody else. People who sexually abuse children can be found in families, schools, churches, recreation centers, youth sports leagues, and any other place children gather. Significantly, abusers can be and often are other children. The younger the victim, the more likely the abuser is a family member. Of those molesting children under the age of 6, 50% were family members. And that makes sense because that child's not out in the world as much just yet, but 50% of them then are being abused by somebody in the family. Family members also accounted for 23% of those abusing children from ages 12 to 17. So it goes down that it's a family member as kids get older, but still a significant amount of the abuse is done by family members. About 60% of children are sexually abused by somebody that the family trusts, which makes it very confusing and very difficult for the survivor to truly understand what's going on, because it's often, and also reluctant to talk about what's been happening, because the abuser is often somebody who is known to the family and the family trusts them. These perpetrators, they form relationships with families and children in order to groom them for abuse. I'm sure you've heard that term. Grooming is a process by which an offender gradually draws a victim into a sexual relationship and maintains that relationship in secrecy. They're pretty, give you statistics on what percentage are repeat offenders, but the ones that are really repeat offenders know exactly what they're doing, and they groom children and they groom their families. So often when parents find out later that someone they trusted has done this, they're devastated, and they feel, why didn't I notice? How come I didn't know? But it's important to remember this person is also grooming the family by winning over their trust. I'll tell you a little bit more about how people groom. At the same time they're grooming the child, this is a quote from Darkness to Light, the same time they're grooming the child, the offender may also fill roles within the victim's family that make them trusted and valued. So they're a neighbor who's always helpful, they're a babysitter who's always there. They're often people that have won over the parents as well. Grooming behaviors can include things like paying special attention to kids, taking them on outings, bringing them gifts, and what child isn't going to respond to that? That's the thing you have to keep in mind. It is so easy to groom a child. I mean, sometimes when I'm out walking around, I see a kid run past me real fast. I say, "Oh, you're so fast!" And they always whip around, and they usually say, "Mommy, she said I'm so fast." Kids are so hungry for any kind of attention and validation. We all come into this world longing for that kind of love and attention, and not enough of us get it. So it's easy for groomers to take advantage of that longing. They isolate the child from others. Over time, they get them more and more isolated. They've fulfilled needs that the child has that are not being met. And that's exactly how they really hook them. They may fill needs and roles within the family, and that's how they hook the family. They treat the child as if they're older, and they gradually start to cross physical boundaries, and they become increasingly sexual or intimate. But they do that gradually, so that they've won the kid over, and also then the kid will feel like in some ways they were complicit in what happened to them. They use secrecy, blame, and threats to maintain control over that child. 70% of child sex offenders have between 1 and 9 victims. So a very high percentage have anywhere from 1 to 9 victims. So keep that in mind. Most abusers, even the most severe abusers, still perpetrate against more than one child. I have people that they were abused by someone in the family and found out subsequently that that man abused or woman abused other family members as well. 70% have anywhere from 1 to 9 victims, and 20% have 10 to 40 victims. So there are perpetrators that are more ill and more compulsive, who have really high rates of sexual abuse. I heard a talk when I was working at Boston University in the counseling center. A man came in, he had written a book about being abused by his coach, and the publisher really did not want him to name that man. And he insisted that he be able to name him. And he did name him in the book. And this was probably 40 years later, since the abuse had taken place. And he started getting phone calls from kids that were still being coached by this man who were being sexually abused by him. So he was so grateful that he won the editors over and could name this man, because they started coming forward. So it's not like they necessarily stop abusing. 40% of children, though, who are molested are abused by an older or more powerful child. People don't understand that it's not uncommon for an older sibling to abuse a younger sibling. It could be a babysitter who really is just a teenager themselves, but 40% of children are molested by other children, so that's something to keep in mind. So why don't children tell? People always say, well, why didn't the child just tell somebody? You would think somebody would tell. There are many reasons why children are reluctant to tell someone that they're being abused. Abusers often tell the child. If they tell them, no one will believe them. They tell the child, nobody's going to take your word over mine. And if the person is somebody that the family trusts or even admires, such as back in, I don't even know if it's just back in the day, but certainly in the Catholic Church, if you were abused by a priest, I can tell you, you'd not think that your family was going to take your word over the word of a priest. Raised in a Catholic family, so I know that. Oftentimes the child is told that they won't be believed, and often they have good reason to think they won't be believed. I'm also quoting from a Child Safe, which is an organization. Sexual predators are master manipulators and will often instruct children to keep the abuse a secret, that it's something special that just the two of them are doing. This tactic is used frequently, especially with younger children. So if you've been abused, you probably know what I'm talking about. They're master manipulators, and you know what? It's not hard to outsmart a kid. How fair is that battle? The Alliance for Children wrote, "There's often a delay in children telling, which sometimes leads people to doubt their assertions." And this is from a forensic investigator. She said, "As a forensic interviewer, I testify in civil and criminal court on a regular basis about child sexual abuse dynamics. I've seen that people find it difficult to believe victim statements of sexual abuse because so often they waited months, sometimes years, to report their experiences of abuse." She goes on to say, "As a professional in the field, this can be frustrating, as delayed disclosures are very common." Why do victims of sexual abuse delay reporting when they're living through their own personal nightmare? In the past year in Tarrant County, this was, I think, in Chicago, over half of the children interviewed at the Alliance for Children delayed reporting their abuse. So, unfortunately, because children often delay telling, that then calls into question their credibility, which is really unfortunate, but it really means that people don't understand how difficult it is for a child to come forward. So they don't understand why there's been a delay. Other research also supports the high number of victims that delay disclosure or wait to disclose until adulthood. We also see these trends, in high-profile cases that are in the media. There are many different sexual abuse dynamics, this is a quote, that affect why children may wait to tell or never disclose at all. And again, I'm going to review some of those. Abusers may threaten to hurt other family members or even beloved pets. I had people who were told, "I'll kill your dog." Some children believe they're protecting a younger sibling by sort of sacrificing themselves I dealt with a young woman who, it was her father. She was his victim, and she felt in some ways by allowing him, she didn't allow him, but by not telling about his abuse of her, she was protecting younger siblings. So some years later, after she had finally talked about this publicly as an adult, she found out that her younger sisters had not been protected, and that he, in fact, was continuing to sexually, or had continued to sexually abuse them as well. And she was just devastated. But that's not an uncommon dynamic for a protective older child to think, well, if I let dad do this to me, at least he won't do it to the other kids. So there's lots of reasons why kids don't tell, including that they think they're protecting their siblings. Perpetrators are very good at convincing children that they are responsible for what happened. And if a child wanted attention, as most children do, or their bodies responded to the stimulation, which is easy to, which is just a normal physiological response to stimulation, it's easy then to convince them that they bear responsibility for what happened. It causes deep feelings of shame, which are internalized and last a lifetime and do significant psychological harm. The belief that you are somehow responsible for what happened stays with you as a child and you carry it into adulthood. I think the worst legacy of sexual abuse and any other kind of abuse, frankly, is the feeling of shame. When children are being taken advantage of, people are hurting children. Children have two choices. Either my mother and father are bad people or I'm a bad person. It can be really frightening for a child to entertain the possibility that their parents are bad because they have no control over their parents and they're at their mercy. So children will say things to themselves like, well, if I'm smart enough, if I'm good enough, if I don't bother daddy, if I don't bother mommy, I'll get the love I finally need. It's a way to have hope in the hopeless situation. This is what Judith Herman says. It's a way to feel like you have control in a situation over which you have no control. It's an illusion to keep the children develop in order to stay hopeful and have a sense that maybe they can make things better. But the price they pay is when they can't make mommy and daddy stop drinking or stop abusing them. They believe it really was their fault. Abusers often will say to children, you made me do that. You got me aroused. The group Stop It said child may feel that they permitted the abuse and should have been able to stop it. They forget, especially even looking back as adults, you think, well, I was a smart kid. How come I couldn't make it stop? Well, you were a kid, and you really, looking back as an adult, you can't really understand how small you were, how young you were, how much bigger that person was, how hard that would have been to do. So it's so important people to remember that there are no situations where a child is responsible for any kind of sexual interaction with a more powerful child or adult. And that legacy, that sense of shame, which leads to shame is the belief that you are somehow inherently flawed or inadequate or not good enough and unlovable. Many of us struggle with this. It can come from many different experiences, but that sense that you're really down deep, not good enough, is at the root of so many of the problems that we have. It's why we don't treat ourselves well, why we don't let other people, we let other people treat us badly. It's a legacy that I think is the worst legacy of child abuse, that the child blames themselves and walks away thinking there's something wrong with them. If the abuser is a parent, children may be very afraid that telling will break up the family or lead to the child being removed from the home. I know of one situation, horrible abuse in the courts, father being adjudicated, and the child wanted to recant what they had said because they didn't want the family to break up. Even though the family not breaking up would mean living with somebody who did something so horrific, you and I would not be able to understand why that child would ever want to be around that person. But the desire to have your family intact, the desire to still be around the non-perpetrating parent can be so strong that children are afraid to tell for that reason. I'm going to quote again, this is from the Alliance of Children, for Children. Some victims of sexual abuse live in homes where they feel a lack of support due to dysfunctional dynamics, separated parents, single parent homes, or may just feel like their caregivers have too much going on and do not have time to listen to them. Children at times also feel responsible for the well-being of their families, and they're afraid of ruining the relationships between the perpetrator and other family members. At other times, the perpetrator is a main source of income for the family, and children may fear that reporting will lead to the family becoming homeless or unable to put food on the table. These are very real fears that children have in terms of reporting their abuse. Younger children, very young children, they may not even understand what's happening to them. They may not understand it's inappropriate. They may lack the words to explain to anybody what is happening to them. And older children may be too embarrassed or again have internalized a sense of blame to tell somebody what happened. Finally, boys can be particularly reluctant to report sexual abuse. Boys may feel particularly ashamed about their abuse because we live in a culture that pressures men to be strong and to equate, being a man with being strong. And so as a result, having to admit that they were vulnerable and something happened to them is particularly difficult. And I'm quoting from, there's an organization called 1 in 6 that's organized for men who have been sexually abused. You'll have a link to their organization at the end of the handout on resources. They write, our society expects males to be able to protect themselves. Successful men are depicted as never being vulnerable, either physically or emotionally. So that's why it's particularly hard for boys sometimes to come forward. And again, perpetrators often play on boys' curiosity about sex. And so you have the coach that says, well, come over to my house and I'll show you Playboy magazine. And the kid thinks, well, that'd be cool, and they don't realize they're being led down the garden path. And by the time they realize it, they feel like they're complicit. So there's a lot of reasons why children don't tell about their abuse. That's only some of them. Often people raise questions about whether or not you can remember childhood sexual abuse, or if you only remember fragments, how do you determine whether you're sexually abused? Well, there's questions about whether you can forget and later recall traumatic memories. Sort of a big debate in our field. Loftus, who came up with the idea of the false memory syndrome, she did some experiments where she planted false memories in someone's head about an event they witnessed or saw, and then followed them up months later, and we're able to show that these people had internalized that memory and actually believed the memory that she had implanted. So that's when she came up with the idea that it's easy to plant false memories, and she started to essentially use that to accuse therapists of planting false memories in clients' brains. Now, her critics have said traumatic memory is stored very differently and processed very differently than that kind of a memory. And trying to create something in a laboratory environment will never really be able to assess the nature of memory. But it is true that memory is tricky. We don't always remember things accurately, so it is a fact that we can't always determine for sure if somebody was sexually abused. Um, Studies that followed up with individuals who did have documented abuse in childhood suggest, however, that amnesia about those events is not only possible, it's actually very likely. So forgetting about the abuse and having it come back later or having it come back in fragments, actually, there's a reason for that. In one study, 38% of women who had previously documented experiences of sexual victimization, and I think these were kids who were brought into the emergency room when they were about 5 years old, and they had experienced such a bad sexual abuse that they had things like torn rectums and torn vaginas. They ended up in an emergency room because they had a severe sexual abuse experience. 17 years later, almost 40% of those kids did not recall that they were sexually abused. I think they gave them a questionnaire that included many, many questions, one of which was, were you ever sexually abused as a child? And almost 38% did not remember that they had been sexually abused. And we are talking about documented severe sexual abuse. Another sample of 450 adult clinical subjects who reported sexual abuse histories were studied for their pattern of repressing memories. A total of 267 subjects, which is about 60%, identified some period in their lives before the age of 18 when they had no memory of the abuse. So again, almost 60% of people who subsequently did remember their abuse as adults know there were periods when they did not remember their abuse. Finally, another researcher in a study of female patients who found that abuse of any kind was also highly correlated with dissociation. This is an important thing to understand. When people experience something traumatic, they dissociate. And I'll read you a definition of dissociation, but let me tell you what it is. It's really you disconnect from how you're really feeling. Let me read you a definition. I think you'll understand what I'm talking about. Dissociation is disconnection between a person's thoughts, memories, feelings, actions, or sense of who or she is. This is a normal process for everyone everyone has experienced. Examples of mild common dissociation include daydreaming, highway hypnosis, or getting lost in a book or a movie, all of which involves losing touch with your awareness of your immediate surroundings. So they're talking about how when you're driving down the highway and 10 minutes go by and you realize, I don't even remember going past that store. Times when we just sort of space out. This is not an uncommon thing for all of us to do, and it's very, very common when we're going through something traumatic. Even when you talk to people who've been in car accidents, they'll talk about like it felt unreal, like it was in slow motion. These are experiences of dissociation. And dissociation is very common to people who have been sexually abused. I worked with a lot of rape survivors, and they would describe the exact same thing to me. They would say, I don't know if it was that bad. I just remember staring at this poster that was across from the bed, and I don't really remember much of what happened. The psyche has this ability to throw a valve and shut down all your emotions. It says, it's too dangerous here, I'm turning everything off. So you don't feel anything, you don't remember things, and that's what dissociation is. People may feel as though the experience is unreal, or if it's happening to somebody else. Sometimes people feel like they were outside themselves watching it. Let me read you Judith Herman's incredible description of dissociation because it really captures it. You probably heard me talk about this before. Sometimes situations of inescapable danger may evoke not only terror and rage, but also, paradoxically, a state of detached calm in which terror, rage, and pain dissolve. Events continue to register in awareness, but it's as though these events have been disconnected from their ordinary meanings. Participants may be numbed or distorted, perceptions may be numbed or distorted, and with partial amnesia or loss of particular sensations. I have people that said to me, I can't remember feeling anything from my waist down when they were sexually assaulted. I was running across the street and a car ran into me. It was a truck. I wasn't hurt real badly, but I jumped up and I just remember thinking, like, that didn't just happen. That's so unreal. It didn't feel real to me. So if you ever had an experience where something scary happened and you just suddenly went numb and it felt unreal, that's what we're talking about. And let me continue with her description of dissociation. Time sense may be altered, often with a sense of slow motion, and the experience may lose its quality of ordinary reality. The person may feel as though the event is not happening to her, but as though she is observing from outside her body, or as though the whole experience is a bad dream from which she will awaken. These perceptual changes, this is really important, these perceptual changes combine with a feeling of indifference, emotional detachment, and profound passivity in which the person relinquishes all initiative and struggle. This was something I had to explain to rape survivors. Why did I stop fighting at some point? Because when you dissociate and you disconnect and your psyche shuts everything down, you will just become immobile. You will just become completely passive. Most people would describe it as, I just laid there and waited for it to get over with. This is the same thing that is experienced by children. She went on to say, this altered state of consciousness might be regarded as one of nature's small mercies, a protection against unbearable pain. A rape survivor describes this detached state. I left my body at that point. I was over next to the bed watching this happen. I dissociated from the helplessness. I was standing next to me and there was just this shell on the bed. That's dissociation, the most extreme version being when you literally feel like you're outside of your own body and you're watching it as if it's happening to somebody else. And dissociation is a knee-jerk, not even under your control response to being in a traumatic situation. It is something the psyche does automatically when people are in a situation where they feel really afraid or terrified or overwhelmed. Now, I'm quoting from Child Safe again. Dissociation likely plays a key role in why people don't always remember the sexual abuse they experienced. Child Safe says, dissociation is defined as disruptions in awareness of circumstance, consciousness, identity, memory, physical actions, and environment. This state of being can help children live through abuse by psychologically separating the child from the trauma as the abusive event is occurring. Sometimes children who dissociate from abusive events do not recall the abuse until sometime in the future. So that dissociation, that leaving, that finding a way to be still physically present because you can't escape, but to be psychologically distant is how people survive trauma. But it also explains sometimes why people can't remember much about the abuse because they were there and they were not there. I hope that makes sense. Once researcher Chu reported that abuse that happened at an early age was highly correlated with dissociation. More frequent sexual abuse was also associated with high levels of dissociation. And other findings from that study include that most remember the abuse for the first time while at home, not during a therapy session. Part of the reason they asked that question in the study was because people like Loftus and other people came along and accused therapists of implanting memories in their clients' brains of abuse that really didn't happen. I don't believe anybody really planted any memories. I think if you work enough with abuse survivors, you start hearing things that you know are pretty suggestive of dissociation or the likelihood of dissociation in response to something traumatic. For example, I had a client who said she could remember hearing her father's footsteps coming up the steps at night, and then she couldn't remember anything after that until she woke up the next morning. And the sound of his feet coming up the steps caused an intense feeling of terror for her. And then she can't remember anything after that. It's very hard for me not to believe that that's pretty strongly suggestive of sexual abuse. You don't blank something out unless something traumatic happened. You don't go numb emotionally unless there's a lot of feelings you're trying to bury. Um, so, that's part of what plays a role in not being able to remember these things. And in this study, what looked for people who had partial amnesia, 89% remembered it when they were at home. It wasn't because they were talking about it in therapy. Um, this same group was able to hunt down verification of whether the abuse really happened. They were asked if they could find some kind of validation that suggested the abuse was really, that they had corroboration for the abuse. And the 89% of the participants who were in this study who reported physical and sexual abuse and who attempted corroboration were able to find some kind of verification. 89%, it's almost 90%. And they say this rate of verification was similar to another study that found 84% of those who had initially had amnesia regarding their abuse were able to find information that corroborated the abuse. So there's a very good likelihood that, partial memories or, memories that come back later in life really are related to actual experience. But more recent research on how children process and store memories, I think, lend even more insight into how this can happen. Part of the reason we can't recall pivotal experiences from our childhood is and understand how they're affecting us because they're stored in the brain in a way that's different how non-traumatic memories are recalled. Bessel van der Kolk, who I quote in some other parts of this talk, he did a study where he scanned the brains of people remembering a non-traumatic memory and a traumatic memory. Non-traumatic memory, frontal lobes, front part of the brain, filing cabinets of the brain. Non-traumatic memory, you can kind of go into those filing cabinets, pull out the memory. Broca's area, which is associated with speech, lights up, so people can talk about that experience. But when you scan the brain, when someone was recalling a traumatic memory, frontal lobes did not light up. What lit up was the amygdala, which is a very emotional part of the brain associated with fight and flight. So remembering something traumatic did not lead to immediate kind of cognitive thinking. It led to this very quick emotional response triggered by the amygdala, and the visual part of the brain lit up, not the speech part of the brain. So people would have images, but they would find it harder to talk about. So pretty telling that actually, literally, when they scan brains of people recalling those kind of memories, the brain works differently. Janina Fisher explains that trauma in childhood is primarily recorded in the right side of the brain. We have a right side and a left side, and we have this corpus callosum that's kind of the bridge between those two hemispheres. While we are born with both right and left hemispheres, we are right hemisphere dominated for most of our childhood. She says left brain dominance is only achieved very gradually over the course of the first 18 years of life. In addition, the corpus callosum, that bridge that allows the two parts of the brain to talk to each other and makes right brain, left brain communication possible, also develops slowly and only becomes fully elaborated around the age of 12. So the right hemisphere of the brain is where a lot of experiences are being recorded during childhood, not the left hemisphere, and we don't really gain access to the left hemisphere and the corpus callosum until between 12 and 18. Now, the tricky thing about this is the right hemisphere of the brain doesn't have words. It only has visual images. It does, and I'm quoting here, the right hemisphere of the brain, it doesn't have words, it is more visual, but it does read body language and facial expressions. Traumatic memories are recorded in the right hemisphere outside of conscious awareness. And this represents the traumatic memories in imagistic forms. So the way it records those memories is more in pictures or snapshots because it's being recorded more by the right hemisphere of the brain. It also, however, records with that the survival behaviors that were employed by that child as a result of their abuse. And this allows for the fact that emotional learning of the right, especially of stressful traumatic experiences, is not known to the left. So you have a part of the brain where these memories are being stored that is not communicating with the left hemisphere of the brain, which is the more talkative, more cognitive part of the brain. It's stored in a part of the brain that is driven more by images, but also survival mechanisms, ways children coped with this. What Dr. Fisher is suggesting is that experiences that are painful or traumatic can be stored in a brain in a way that causes them to remain unconscious, but the survival tactics they give rise to shape our behavior profoundly. This is why many of our behaviors, feelings, psychological, even physical symptoms only make sense when we can tie them back to those original experiences and understand where they came from. But if those experiences happened when we were very young, it's very difficult to make those connections. Others have suggested a young child may not recall the event, but may recall only the feelings and physical sensations. I'm quoting, the traumatic experience may be translated into nervous or timid behavior by the child who does not understand exactly what happened or may not be able to remember the specific events. As a result, the child is only able to recall the feelings and sensations that occurred during the incidents. There are people that the way they first begin to experience or reconnect with the possibility of childhood sexual abuse has to do with they start having what we call body memories. They have physical sensations, say they're in a particular situation that reminds them of something. They may break out in a sweat. They may be terrified. Their body may respond as if they're in danger, even though they're not. And developmentally, the younger you are when you're abused, the less you're going to remember things well and accurately. Friedman said, kids remember sensory memories. They don't have memories that are all coherent like XYZ occurred, but they remember they felt a lot of tension or fear. So strong unexplained reactions to particular people or specific locations or certain activities, feelings of vulnerability. Whenever you feel vulnerable or you don't feel in control, you start becoming very terrified, have physiological reactions of panic. Those are all indications of early childhood trauma. Um, of course, those reactions can be triggered by any number of past experiences. It doesn't have to be just sexual abuse. This is why the American Psychological Association also points out that experts don't yet know enough about how memory works to tell a real recovered memory from a false memory, unless other evidence supports the memory. The American Psychological Association, in response to questions about whether memories can be repressed and whether a false memory can be suggested and implanted, is in someone memory says, these questions lie at the heart of the memory of childhood abuse issue. Experts in the field of memory and trauma can provide some answers, but clearly more study and research are needed. What we do know is that both memory researchers and clinicians who work with trauma agree that both phenomena occur. So they're kind of covering their bases here. They're saying it's possible that what you're remembering is a real memory, but since we can't really validate it, it's also possible that it's it's a false memory. Now, my experience is that when people are remembering something that's disturbing to them, um, there's some grain of truth to what they're remembering. And I do think there's a danger in not acknowledging the possibility of abuse because the child already grew up thinking that if they ever told anybody, nobody would believe them. So I, as a therapist, am not going to give them that experience. Well, I have to say I can't know for sure. I will say things like you're describing so much of what I've heard other sexual abuse survivors describe, but of course I can't without any uh, certainty say exactly what happened to you. But a lot of times what you see is that um, there are some survivors that have clear memories, there are some that have partial memories, there's some people that will never have any memories. But in some cases, the symptoms of those memories, the symptoms of people with memories and those without memories are so similar that you have to sort of say to yourself, what helps one will help the other. So if you experience discomfort with physical intimacy, or you're prone to dissociating when you feel overwhelmed emotionally, if you frequently feel emotionally numb, if you struggle with feelings of unworthiness or don't trust people very easily, then you have symptoms that are common among survivors. And therapy that addresses those symptoms are going to be helpful to you, whether you were sexually abused or not. So, rather than get caught up in, do I know for sure? You can also just say, I know this, you're struggling with something that bothered you and you have symptoms that are common to abuse survivors. And I think the things I do with abuse survivors to help them would be helpful to you. What are the most? So let's talk a little bit about the long-term impact of sexual abuse, because it's not just it's done and it's behind you. I wish that were really true. People say to me, "Why focus on the past? It's behind me now." And I'm like, I wish you were right. I wish I didn't know as much as I do about how those beliefs you internalized about yourself live on in you. But I know they live on in you because they shape how you look at yourself. They shape how you look at other people. They shape what you conclude about why things happen. They shape you so profoundly. And not knowing that and not understanding that link really puts you at the mercy of those experiences. You didn't put them behind you. They actually have more control over you if you don't talk about them and look at them. Many of the ongoing symptoms or issues that people have as adults are related to the coping strategies they developed as children. Tracy wrote, "It is useful to understand that survivor symptoms or behavioral symptoms resulting from childhood sexual abuse often represent coping strategies employed in response to abnormal traumatic events. These coping mechanisms are used for protection during the abuse or later to guard against feelings of overwhelming helplessness and terror." So a lot of the issues we develop, a lot of our coping strategies, they served us when we were children. They outlived their usefulness as adults, but they're hard to let go of. And they're hard to let go of because our very survival and whether we're going to get love or not feels like it's on the line. Research shows 30 to 40% of individuals who had child abuse, sexual abuse as children have a lifetime history of depression, 30 to 40% compared to 10 to 20% of people who weren't abused. So higher risk of depression. The depression also starts earlier and has a more chronic or kind of long-lasting course. Also, people with a history of sexual abuse are more prone to suicide and in some cases borderline personality disorder. But again, in saying this, I want to remind everybody, not everybody develops these. It's not like, you're destined to have these symptoms if you went through child abuse went through sexual abuse as a child. A meta-analysis, and that means a study that looked at multiple studies. So it was a study that looked at 37 other studies that looked at the psychological problems common to survivors, found a statistically significant correlation between childhood sexual abuse and a lifetime diagnosis of anxiety disorder, depression, eating disorders, post-traumatic stress, sleep disorders, and suicide attempts. So again, you aren't more at risk for having some of those symptoms if you were abused as a child. But again, some of those problem behaviors also that we develop aren't necessarily a diagnosable condition, but they represent coping strategies that outlive their helpfulness. As an example, you grew up in an unpredictable household, whether it was sexual abuse or physical abuse that you might be subjected to, you become hypervigilant. I think most people know what I'm talking about. It means you're always scanning the horizon for any signs of danger that can develop as a result of an abusive or explosive or alcoholic parent, or being left alone with somebody who's going to sexually abuse you. As we know, abusers can be other children, babysitters, grandparents, other family members, a neighbor, clergy, or trusted family members. So, people that are considered safe, you have learned are not safe, which makes you much more prone to not trusting people and scanning the horizon and watching for clues as to who really is safe and who isn't. Individuals who were sexually abused when they were left by a parent with somebody else as adults may be very fearful of being alone or separated from their partners. We know that children escape the inescapable by dissociating. It's a way to be somewhere without being fully present. And it's experienced in adulthood as spacing out or numbing out when something is upsetting. It can be subtle again or extreme. Chronic abuse can result in persistent utilization of dissociative defenses, including amnesia into childhood. So for some people that had persistent and regular abuse can't remember like years of their life. And also, if you coped with dissociation as a child, you're more likely to use dissociation as an adult. For example, Judith Herman, who wrote Trauma and Recovery, an incredibly good book, said that sexual abuse survivors are at greater risk for sexual assault as adults because of their tendency to dissociate when danger arises. And she says this is a very dangerous statistic because it can make it sound as if you're blaming the victim. You're blaming the woman who gets raped as an adult because of her history of childhood sexual abuse. But she's saying no. What's happening though is when somebody picks up a sense of danger, they either, if they're hypervigilant, they may be the person that gets up and leaves immediately, or they may be the person who dissociates and kind of just numbs out and gets kind of paralyzed in a way. In one study, survivors who reported having amnesia about their abuse were 6.6 times more likely to be at risk for sexual assault compared to non-abused counterparts in adulthood. Child sexual abuse can also lead to very self-destructive behaviors in adults. This comes from a variety of roots. First, if the child blamed themselves for the abuse, they may conclude they're defective or bad or unworthy of love. And then as adults, they're very hypercritical of themselves. We're all prone to this, and they treat themselves badly or they allow other people to treat them badly because they internalize this sense that they were bad. In some cases, self-destructive behaviors are rooted in efforts to numb or control overwhelming emotions. So survivors who try to cope with their emotions by drinking or overeating or taking drugs, it's a self-destructive behavior, but it's also just an attempt to numb out the pain. Even things like cutting or self-harm can represent an attempt to. I had people that would cut and they'd say the emotional pain was so bad that sometimes when they physically cut themselves, they felt like at least they were able to release some of the emotional pain by creating physical pain. Sometimes people who get very dissociated cut because it brings them back into their bodies. They're so disconnected from their bodies. I know it sounds strange, but doing something physically painful would help them get grounded back in their bodies. Linehan would suggest to people that instead of cutting themselves, they get an ice cube and you run an ice cube over themselves, or they put their face in a bowl of cold water as a way to jolt themselves back into their body so that they don't do something that hurts them. Children who are sexually abused as adults sexually abused as children are more likely to put themselves in risky situations. Ironically, this can be an attempt to heal the original feelings of powerlessness they felt as a child, but they often backfire. I would see this with rape survivors. They didn't want to have that rape ruin sex for them, so they'd get back on the horse and ride, so to speak. But then, of course, because they were still traumatized from the rape, they would numb out during the sexual encounter, and so it would be actually more of it would make them feel even more powerless again and have another bad sexual experience. But the intent was to try to take their power back. So in a weird way, sometimes people put themselves in risky situations because now they want to be able to be in that risky situation and be in control this time. It might sound confusing, but it actually makes a whole lot of sense. The complex nature of the causes of self-destructive behavior is captured in this quote from the webpage entitled Pandora's Project. Many traumatized people expose themselves, seemingly compulsively, to situations reminiscent of the original trauma. These behavioral reenactments are rarely consciously understood to be related to their earlier experiences. Survivors of earlier rape and abuse may put themselves at risk of further harm, not because they want to be abused or hurt, but because they may be seeking a different or a better outcome, or to be more in control. It may also be because they believe they deserve the pain inflicted on them. Often reenactment has a compulsive, involuntary feel to it. Survivors may feel completely numbed and they're unaware of how the reenactment is taking place. Conversely, it may call forth the same terror and shame experienced in childhood. This is a quote from van der Kolk, who further explained, people who are exposed early to violence or neglect come to expect it as a way of life. Now, again, I would say this ranges along a continuum. Not all survivors of childhood abuse reenact their abuse or cut themselves or engage in severe self-destructive behaviors. It really is along a continuum, but it's not difficult to imagine that if you internalize feelings of shame, this belief that this happened to you because you're flawed, you're not worthy of love, there's something wrong with you. If you internalize that belief, it's not hard to see why you would find it difficult to be assertive, find it difficult to ask for the help that you need, find it hard to express your needs and set limits and say no, and hard to treat yourself with self-compassion. So those are the less extreme versions of self-abuse, but they all stem from that same feeling of unworthiness. People sexually abused as children had their boundaries didn't have their boundaries respected when they were young, and they were violated by people who were bigger and more powerful than themselves. And they learned there was no point in saying no because the perpetrator didn't care about their feeling or discomfort. Resisting could have made the abuse even worse. All of this then becomes intertwined with feelings of worthlessness and self-blame and reinforces a sense of powerlessness. Adult sexual abuse as children have a profoundly painful experience perpetrated by someone in a position of power and of having their needs and their feelings shoved aside in a very profound way. They likely had no one to run to for comfort, so they buried those feelings and those needs rather than be painfully alone with them. And dissociation then began a pattern of disconnecting from their internal experience of feelings and needs. And they also then develop a pattern of accommodating those people in positions of power in order to not anger or upset them. And they may disappear too, because disappearing and taking up as little space as possible is a way to avoid unwanted attention. These are all things you do as a child that become patterns as an adult. Your needs were shoved aside, so you treat yourself as if your needs don't matter. You had no one to run to comfort you, so you feel like you always have to deal with things on your own. You had to try to appease somebody in a position of power, so you become very good at people pleasing. This is something many of us deal with. And in some ways, especially if you got unwanted sexual attention as a child, you may, as an adult, do things like gain a lot of weight so that you don't draw a lot of attention to yourself. or you may just have a way of always disappearing, even in social situations, because down deep, it's being seen as, you long to be seen because anyone wants to be seen and loved, but you also associate being seen with danger. So sometimes what also happens is you're taught to bury your needs and feelings because you're in a situation where nobody cares about them. But then what happens as an adult is you repress those feelings like anger over and over and over again, but they finally reach a boiling point and then you blow up and it surfaces in a way that seems out of proportion to the situation. And then you go back to this pattern of burying it again. Harriet Lerner wrote a book called Women in Anger. She said that's a common way women deal with anger. We think it's not okay, so we bury it and bury it and bury it. By the time we finally blow, we look like a crazy person because we seem like we're overreacting to a small situation. But it's because we've been pairing that anger. And of course, then we start the pattern all over again. So problems with emotional regulation are not uncommon consequences of being sexually abused as children. I know we're going to run out of time. I knew this was going to be a tough one. Just quickly say many trauma survivors have problems with sleep, not surprisingly, because people are abused when they sleep at night. Many survivors have symptoms of PTSD, things like intrusive thoughts or images, flashbacks, nightmares. They avoid situations that remind them of the abuse or the person who abused them. They avoid feelings altogether by just numbing out. They avoid things by having memory problems. They have low self-esteem, anxiety, and sleep problems, all signs of PTSD. The worst part, as I mentioned before, is the self-perception. I think the most damaging and long-lasting consequence of child sexual abuse is the shame that develops when victims blame themselves. They can, and I'm quoting, say, permanently skew a person's sense of self-worth. Traumatic experiences can result in the development of a shamed sense of self, the belief that one is inherently flawed, defective, not good enough, and unworthy of love and belonging. And as already noted, shame begets shame. When you feel like you're unworthy of love, you treat yourself and allow other people to treat you as if you're unworthy of love. And again, for most people, that's along a continuum from subtle, like self-neglect and not paying attention to your needs, to extremes of more severe forms of self-harm. Pandora's Project wrote, personalities forged in an environment of early abuse. Children who are abused by people they are close to learn to equate love with violence and sexual exploitation. They have not learned to create safe and appropriate boundaries with people, and they grow up unable to see themselves as having any right to choose. Their self-image is so damaged that they see nothing wrong with even extremely abusive treatment of them by others. It is seen as unavoidable and the ultimate cost of love. Some women sexually abused as children may believe that sexuality is all they have of any worth, because that was the only thing that ever got them any attention. I'm just going to wrap up and say a few more things that can lead to a lot of physical symptoms. There's a lot of research that shows adults with a history of sexual abuse are 30 times more likely than non-abused peers to have serious medical conditions like diabetes, cancer, heart problems. Your body is always on alert. That hyperarousal takes a toll on your body. You can read more about it in the handout. Sexual problems, no surprise there. They can be on anywhere along a continuum from no desire to be sexual to being hypersexual. And again, for a lot of survivors, the challenge is to not dissociate when they're being sexual, because that's such a knee-jerk response. There's a number of good books written about this: The Survivor's Guide to Sex, Sexual Healing Journey Guide for Survivors. There's plenty of good books you can read about that. Um, Problems being close emotionally with people, not surprisingly. Emotional intimacy and connection requires a willingness to be vulnerable and an ability to trust those who are trustworthy. But if you were betrayed by the people that you should have been able to trust as children, it's going to make it difficult for you not to worry about that as an adult. Trust is such a vital ingredient of relationships, and being vulnerable is too. And that can be hard when you've been betrayed very young in life. What I would say to survivors, adult survivors as well as child survivors, is what you need to learn to have good sex and good relationships is what all of us should learn to have good sex and to have good relationships, which is to communicate effectively, to be able to negotiate conflicts in a healthy way, to stay connected with your feelings and needs and know how to express them, and learn how to both give and receive love, and to be able to listen well. So I often have rape survivors that would say to me, I feel like I'm damaged goods. And I'd say, you know what? No, what you need to do is what everybody else should do anyway if they want to have good connections with others. All right, there's no quick steps to how to resolve this if you were abused as a child, but there are important couple of things I want to say. Know that under no circumstances was it your fault. It is never okay for an adult to take advantage or an older children to take advantage of a child sexually. Um, the people that sexually abuse are very good at grooming their victims and getting them to feel that they had a role in it. But it is never justified for a powerful person to take advantage of a young person's vulnerability, their naivete, their curiosity, or their need for attention. It's always wrong. Ask yourself, what would you say to a child who experienced what you did? There's a very good booklet called It's Not Your Fault, and Christina Cortez also has a very good book called It's Not You, It's What Happened to You. Know that you're not alone. There's at least 42 million other people that are going through this. It occurs in secrecy. It can heal in openness. You need, as an adult, you couldn't get support maybe when you were a kid, but you can get support now. And you need to get support. Your pain is real. Don't minimize it. That already happened to you. Tell someone safe. Brene Brown, who talks a lot about shame, says the best antidote to shame is empathy. We are healed in connection. I mean, we're wounded in connection. We must be healed in connection. And by that, she means being able to talk to people that you can trust about what you went through. Ellen Bass and Lori Davis, who wrote the first book, really big book on sexual abuse called The Courage to Heal, wrote, there are many ways to overcome shame. The most powerful is to simply talk about your abuse. Know that you can heal. People heal all the time from this. Do feel hopeful. Know there's lots of resources available to you. You'll see them listed in your handout. Talk to a therapist. This isn't probably something you should deal with on your own. RAIN, which is the Rape, Abuse, and Incest Network, has a whole page on how therapy could help and what to look for in a therapist. You want to find a therapist, there's a link, Psychology Today. You put in your zip code. There's also an organization in Delaware called SOAR, Survivors of Abuse and Recovery, and they apparently have their main office in Wilmington, but they have offices in Newark, Dover, and Georgetown. I'll end with a few quotes, and then I won't take questions. It takes Wonder Woman courage and Superman strength to heal the wounds of our abuse, because it brings change, and we are inclined to hold on to the stability we created in the chaos of our past experience. So imagine more. Take small steps. Be guided by your personal truth and not the impressions left by the bad guys in your childhood story. Our abusive parents didn't give us, this is what happens when you go too fast. Our abusive parents didn't give us the gentle, encouraging nurturing we needed, but healing invites us to give our inner child the kind of loving empowerment that will help us reach our potential and celebrate our spirit, move past what you wished you could have experienced, and embrace the uncommon, sweet possibilities of being your own best parent. Finally, honoring all the ways we survived as all the ways we survived our child abuse is healing. We are amazing and courageous. All right, I know I threw a lot at you. I need to figure out how to get back so I can see you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Judy.